the structures of the human trafficking system on the basis of the military engaging in the overthrow of the United States public for its arbitrary false experiments, which has actively increased into the Ted Cruz definition of eminent domain without the function of rights, which is actively exchanged for the permissions by permits. And now the blackmail system and the black market system from the Confederate wizard trade uses the act of trading crimes against targets on the basis of those permits, at which point your functional rights become subverted, such as your right to travel, by the attack which has its interest in the crime, at which point the assertion of their status is derived by their criminal nature against the general public, generating the permanent series of injuries. These systems for human trafficking of targets for infinite abuse, which does not have an experimental advantage, is fundamentally the objective of Lindsey Graham's series of Confederate policies in his development and collaboration with the Soviet loyalists inside of the FBI in favor of the creation of the communist system. Now, the mostly fascist, a little communist, mirrors the mostly communist, a little fascist from the Chinese, at which point they've been actively collaborating with, including the plotting for future conflicts and wars, such as the pre-planning of how the battles are going to be strategically implanted, at which point you have a series of exchanges of data, of selling crucial national security secrets in order to provoke future conflicts, in order to assert their dominance over the Americans through the function of the creation of those scheduled wars, which generates at it the interest of investment into security, at which point the parasite would receive more payments for having caused the problem and reduce the security, while demanding more payments in resolution for the threats to be resolved with the security they're paying for. At which point these engagements of systematic subversions of natural rights, such as your right to life, which is existence with human decency at your status, and the laws of war, including the law that you are not allowed to attack civilians, which they are doing. They're not allowed to traffic civilians, which they are doing. They're not allowed to engage in abuse against POWs or experiments against POWs, or put POWs in conflict areas, which they are doing. These systems, having actively engaged in those arrangements, have actively engaged in the compulsory work without payment, which includes the position of the reduction of human decency by the subversion of medical attention. Now, similar to how they have in the past conducted a criminal experiment in order to have a non-interesting, non-substantive, non-returned proof or secondary series of notes, they refused, after they have accomplished their false conclusions, the continued interest to not pay the victims, which they are obligated to pay, in order to not have to pay them their medical attention, which they also have to pay, in order to claim unitary executive theory, or the position of the government just not confessing to the crime having existed. Now, the act of the government actively denying reality is fundamental to their wizard systems, similar to California defending its subversion programs, such as its contact tracing or active denial subversions, and abuses and harassments by the use of military-grade active denial harassment, which is actively invasive into privacy and subversion to the general public, even inside their own homes and their own bedrooms. And while they watch you pee in your own home, this becomes exponentially the status quo norm for their surveillance systems from their wizard communists. At which point, you actively have this position where they're able to suppress your observable competence in performance, which generally decreases your chances of being promoted when they are trying to promote one person economically, socially, sexually, or otherwise. You have the active suppression in order to predetermine winners and predetermine losers, at which point you have the interest of the only competent choices being the ones that the wizards have chosen. At which point women have an exponential dilemma, because they could pay the wizards for having done so while actively destroying their market. Now, the women choosing to comply with that are in an active racket where they are actively paying the rapists to have controlled the market in general. Now, the system of the higher grade wizards take all of the preferred stock first. And as women aren't people to them but chattel, the preferred women are all taken by the predetermined winners by the communists, which, having been chosen by the communists, would have the only non-subverted positions, and having determined their wins, would have the preferred luxuries of competence without competence, having been supported or reinforced by the Confederate system enforcing the communism in question. At which point, once you have the full consumption of the preferred stock, you begin to file down to Plato's conspiracy to the rest of the stock, all of the way down into the children, at which point you have the active pedophile networks, which is engaged by the position that they aren't people, they're chattel, and since they're chattel, similar to the black slaves in the former observed Confederacy, children aren't really children, children are chattel, at which point there is no inherent social taboo concerning the subject, as they are just an irrelevant superior to animals, not quite a full person illusion. They're like the black sites on Mars type example, where they are the fundamental exception to the custom, at which point you have the assertion of these active trades, at which point they actively have to protect their pedophile network in order to have actively paid the contracts to their systems, at which point you have the actively reinforced pedophile network becomes the preferred luxury acquired taste product, as the vast majority of them, having to deal with the remainder of the subject, have the aggression against outsider communities with false aggressions against the outsiders, removing the competitor organizations with the similar fetish. And the more aggressive they are against it, the more expensive it becomes, the higher price it becomes, the higher luxury it becomes, the more the higher members of the product in the product list for the wizards becomes the minors in question, at which point the higher value being the minors from the acceleration of aggression generates the preferred stock's position at the very top. At which point, this is where you're going to have your Jeffrey Epsteins and your J. Sekulows and their clusterfucks as they actively compete for each other's ability to engage in the luxury good. Now, while Jeffrey Epstein's character has been cited in the record as to actively condemn and detest those who, amongst J. Sekulows' extremist white Confederacy, become more violent and abuseful and injure the children, merely going from the luxury good to the Joffrey type abuse system, actively exchanges that, and since the argument under those who have already accepted these similar types of structures in order to have controlled their local families or local communities would have accepted the position that they have forfeited their children to the wizards until they become 18 under the various cons arranged, at which point when they become an adult it is told to them that they would be released, which fundamentally being fraudulent, as the slave drivers have no interest in releasing their slaves. The perpetual extortion systems in place allow for the permanent trading systems, allowing for the dark money to perpetually be ingested into the system, at which point their release of their extortion mechanisms actively traded on their brokerages exchanges unlimited criminal felonies, at which point you have the active funding for their criminal policies and their criminal programs and their criminal strategies, as well as their legal ones, at which point you have this permanent extortion mechanism. Now, the suppression of status being fundamental to the system includes, but is not limited to, the high status, such as David Bowles, in the system. Now, his having been captured at the highest status, according to the projections certified by their acknowledgement of law, was captured on that basis, and the existence of him not being a part of their group becomes the exponential catastrophic threat to the Confederacy, which does not want to release its crimes to the general public, lest the American law find enforcers to arrest their insurrectionist pedophile network. At which point you have a series of contests of them systematically removing their competitors who do not partake in their systems, at which point the system of actually having the threat of morality actively becomes purged. When Ryan Paul, I believe, was the Speaker of the House, they actively threw out their congressional pastor on the basis of him testing them or angering them on the basis of morality, and I believe the exact quote was extremely benign and sensitive in touch, at which point the smallest indication towards morality is actively condemned, which is my fundamental belief on why they executed Jeffrey Epstein, is because he told them that he does not consent to them using the 1983 judicial activism policy of actively torturing civilians, at which point the arbitrary, non-productive abuse of children on top of their sexual fetishes in the supreme dominatrix system being condemned is a light touch towards the direction of morality, which they aggressively condemn, and all things being the same seems to be how things accidentally or on purpose turned out the way that they did, including the protection of his client list, which they just wanted to trade to J. Sekulow's network instead, at which point the trade of the product list being brokered from one system to another system seems objectively normal, as having been condemned in the magic system is an absolute fatality, at which point they having a replacement company to ingest it took over all of the bonds and liabilities actively being traded in the permanent purchase brokering network. Now, these attacks on the fundamental right to liberty is catastrophic to one's ability to choose who they are, which is the fundamental aspect of the Confederacy, as they are a hate group. Social engineering includes the act of manipulation and coercion in favor of the arbitrary changing morality of the Confederacy on the basis of which wizard purchased it and what contract they were enforcing. At which point you have a polyamorous god structure, as each wizard competing with each other over the permits are actively enforcing their arbitrary morality in order to assert themselves as God. At which point you actively have a change by the communists using the system in the market, fundamentally on the basis of those winners and those losers having predetermined who they are, predetermines who has the available funds in order to purchase the permit, in order to assert the longevity of any particular abuse racket system in its short-term range, at which point the larger strategic scale would actively be trading or brokering these minor permit contracts, as they, having actively cycled these exchanges, it becomes more and more fundamental to the corruption of the system, and the judicial activists actively covering for the criminal abuses have acknowledged these positions for their interest in the assertion of the violation of the pursuit of happiness, as the engagement of the use of abuse as a luxury good. The subversion of happiness is the enforcement of objective misery. Now, the active subversion on each ironic position generates the system of creating artificial depressing situations, actively reinforcing their larger ambitions in order to assert themselves as their own criminal racket. At which point, the polyamorous god structure of the wizards actively competing with each other over the chattel of the rest of the public generates for themselves the systematic destruction or collapse of the system in favor of cruelty for the sake of itself. The cruelty itself is the primary goal. They aren't acquiring a strategic end. There isn't a larger purpose. The purpose is the cruelty. At which point you have these systems which have been used in the foreign wars in order to perfect the systems before they're sold down the line to the federal and state and local enforcement mechanisms, to each of the factions of the various communities which have actively been engaged in the system. Now, the malicious contempt for the rule of law by the Constitution from them is the assertion of their judicial activism, as the breach of their oath disqualifies them from the function in the creation of a kangaroo court which has no American authority, at which point the enforcement mechanism is a criminal act, and the system of the Confederate double agents being the only ones who intentionally want the system to exist in the racist structure generates the perpetuation of these systems. Now, the government actively denying its criminal nature by the obstruction of justice is the censoring of the key information of the racist system. Now, if the public cannot observe the racist system in its proper context by those obstructions, then the suspicion lies on the unfortunate side, at which point you have its natural byproducts, which is actively used inside the market, which should be considered the conspiracy theorists. And the conspiracy theorists should be considered less taboo and outsider and more police investigator, more sheriff investigators, more federal investigators. The act of investigating base reality without the illusion or obstruction is the position of investigating the conspiracy or the criminal intent of one or a few people collaborating for the abuses of a particular advantage. At which point, when you have the criminal conspiracy, it's the same thing as criminal intent to engage in the collaboration as a conspiracy. So when you consider a conspiracy, it's just the active engagement of criminal intent before the fact, during the fact, and after the fact, at which point you have the material realization that the obstruction of the investigation is a criminal contempt for courts, and the judicial activism protecting the obstruction is an act of contempt for the court. If the judge has contempt for the court, then they, acting in bad faith, have no authority to the function of the court, and thus are not acting in the capacity of the court. And since they are not acting in the capacity of the court, they may, in that regard, be punished for their crimes as an individual without a legal government, which needs to be the status quo observing, as that is the only reasonable conclusion to the system in question. Now, Lindsey Graham's communist loyalties, such as his use of war powers against the American public under his Confederate policy, which has at its foundational position the obstruction of justice with the active permission to criminal force against anyone for any reason, including race, should fundamentally have received more attention than it did. But the heart of the matter is that all of the Confederates, which are actively pretending to fight each other in their propagandist wars, all agree to the core principle of destroying the United States, which is why they are not reporting on the most fundamental aspects of the War on David series, which has at the heart of the policies the threats to the Americans. Now, each faction actively competing with each other want to assert the dominance over the other. They want to be the Nazis killing the socialists, and not the socialists being killed by the Nazis, having had to support the Nazis in their murder of the socialists. These arbitrary war powers by the Nazi strategies having actively been endorsed, such as by Scalia's statement that the act of the legislator or the executive overrunning the legislator with a policy in order to give an order to engage in the criminal rackets by the secret police structures, which generates the secret punishment structures, which is the fundamental foundation of the Holocaust. He actively supported it, and as someone who hates the United States enough for him to have backed those types of structures, which their systems have actively been essential to its design, have added the matured position of those Holocaust reconstruction systems and the active genocide of all of the outgroups which have helped them as they systematically remove all capable factions of challenging them. Thus, second place factions, third place factions, and all relevant challengers should exponentially be terrified by the engagement of the existence of that system, as their first-placed wizard counterparts will be sending the secret police to murder them horribly. At which point these systems, having exponentially compounded on themselves, is the investment into the chaotic investment of trusting a terrorist, and the American position of not negotiating with terrorists is the observance that terrorists will not follow through on not delivering the particular threat. And since they're not going to deliver any promise to not satisfy their original threat, which was already scheduled, then you have the position of unlimited criminal injuries as a promise. And insurgencies having the tendency to divide infinitely, seeking the position of base order, which is inherently the oxymoron of the insurgency. Being an insurgency, being a double agent, they are the subversions of order, and the position of the insurgency collapses the order. So the insurgents collapse the order to the structure that they're comfortable with, which is then collapsed by the rest of the insurgency infinitely to the bottom, at which point they, seeking order by the collapse of order, will have zero order, at which point you have the structure of the collapse of the total system as a parasite eating the host, at which point there is no host that would be finished, at which point you have the digesting of the remains and sales and cutting apart and distributions of the host, which leads to the conflicts of the future wars, such as the planned war with China and Russia and the rest of them. At which point, they, having sold many strategic blueprints from Lindsey Graham's active investment as a character, he sold American government secrets to the Chinese and to the other enemies of the United States in order to promote these strategic weaknesses as the means of acquiring the proxy war with the other factions, similar to the proxy war in Ukraine against the Russians, where Ukraine is a death machine for Russia, at which point the death machine would be the American factions, at which point the mirroring of these two scenarios generates the position of the larger threat devouring the lesser threat and having it become weak enough to be challenged at the matured scheduled date, at which point you have the acknowledged strategic weaknesses for the eradication of those factions, which, being fully devoured by the future enemies being poked into conflict, generates the exponential catastrophic threat, at which point the only solution is the Americans winning the Civil War. David has to be promoted into the duel, and the Americans have to have raised David back into the acknowledgement of his legal status as he was arrested, so he shall be presented, at which point his status as the aristocracy, as the top-ranked general, leading the Americans in the argument to Congress to declare war on the Confederacy, is necessary to national security and the subversion of these future clusterfucks. Generating that position is the only subversion to the inevitable war with the Confederates and the Chinese and the Russians and the rest of them, according to the schedule which I do not possess. At which point, these catastrophic events by the Soviet loyalists in the FBI, by the Lindsey Graham grade Confederate wizard communists like Lindsey Graham, generates these catastrophic extortions. Now, in capitalism, people trade money. In communism, people trade people. The exponential injury by the genocidal rackets in their communist loyalties generates the Hegelian dialect of the active oppositions. You have one thing invested into which is not what you want, and you have another thing which challenges it, which you do not want, and it synthesizes into the thing that you want, at which point the entire structure collapses into the desired end goal, which is the functional generation of the one-world government under the revelation Satanism, which requires at its foundation the Antichrist ritual, which systematically invests itself into the position of having the creation of the type of person who would want to be those things through the various reasons, including the strong delusions, and those strong delusions including the compromising of people in the terrorist factory of committing extraordinary crimes, justifying the mass abuses, such as the position of getting the Churchians to betray their God in favor of their arbitrary interests into the polyamorous God structure. At which point, their assertion of their dominance theory, creating the position of the enforcement of the morality as God, generates the replacement to God or the Antichrist. At which point, in Revelation, the projection from Jesus when he was asked how everything was going to happen, the position asserted that there are going to be many antichrists before the revealing of the primary antichrist. At which point you have many who claim the morality and public structure and affirmation from the general society to have pretended the morality of their position in the assertion of the replacement to Christ. And their assertion of the replacement to Christ by their surveillance wizard communism generates their self-confidence in that position in their active war against God. At which point, the position that God gave it to Satan to declare war on the Christians, and the Christians would be hunted basically to extinction, is based upon many of these types of terror factory type structures. At which point, the strong delusion of the assertion of their Baal trick, which in the Baal trick you have a prophet who is hired in order to curse Israel, and Israel, having come, was blessed instead, until he came up with a trick, and he said, if you give them your women and you have them worship your idols, if you have them worship your many gods, and they are able to sleep here with your women, then God will curse them himself. At which point, this trick is actively reproduced in the service of turning the Churchians into devil-worshipping Satanists. At which point, they no longer have the protection of God, at which points they could be hunted to the nth degree and be completely annihilated on the basis that they are no longer serving under God. And having no loyalties to God, they, having abandoned God, have no security under the shield which would have otherwise been protecting them. And without plot armor to protect them, they are easy pickings to kill. Take as an example their predetermined strategies in order to enforce these types of concepts from the liberals. You have the he, she, him, her, them, their, as, and all of the various pronouns which are actively enforced, which is a legitimate thing, as the wizards using the Confederate policy from Lindsey Graham are actively abusing, harassing, and trolling them. They, actively being followed by their abusers, are incapable of avoiding the harassment, and since they aren't legally safe, they are actively dependent on the general community to stop their injuries by the limiting of the triggers of the assaults, at which point they seem more sensitive because they are being assaulted, and the act of having been assaulted gives them a vulnerability which requires additional tender care and attention and sensitivities, and the acknowledgement that the actual offense is happening in base reality is necessary in order to stop it, at which point those who want to complain about pronouns and other issues by the victims actively have to subvert the government harassing them in messing with the enemy campaigns by the military, at which point you have these structures which actively reinforce themselves. So you have the predetermined conclusion where they are given the exponential increase in support and power and affirmation beyond their security. At which point you have the exponential political currency in the momentum, generating their ability to engage in the larger objective injuries which they were seeking on the basis of the particular thing relevant to the specific victim in the phantom cells controlling them. The specific tendency is natural to the victim once given the power, generating the larger strategic ambition as the Fraise ou type strategies creates a benign looking observable thing which concludes into a larger catastrophic scheme. At which point, the act of giving them what they need in order to have received proper security is creating the larger injury. Instead of the observation of the security of the rule of law, of equal rights under law, you have the alternative to the laws of nature. You have the loyalty to the Confederate permit magic structure. Now, when you have your loyalties to the permit structure from the Confederacy, you generate these tendencies towards those injuries, as it seems benign under which you've been socialized by the social engineers to have accepted as primarily normal. At which point you have the catastrophic injury on the scheduled maturity. The alternative, of course, is the actual stable, fair rule of law being enforced, and that includes the arresting of the Confederates who have been found inside the government, which is a byproduct of the United States winning the Civil War by bringing David to the duel in full status, in full uniform, in full acknowledgement of Congress, in his lawful status as he was arrested by these criminal human trafficking structures, generates the ability to start arresting the double agent traitors. And with the arresting of the double agent traitors in the due process procedures, actively removing the threats to the public, you have the only actual competent solution. Our original agreement is adequate to the resolutions necessary to the restabilizing of the general society and communities, which they are actively subverting by the existence of the double agents. Now, the trick by the enemies of the United States committing treason is, again, the reinforcement into the loyalties and concepts of the Confederate permit structure, sales and distributions of the many-god structure by the active investment into many middle-class families which are actively a part of the trades in the various abuses, receiving their rewards on the basis of the satisfaction of their specific arbitrary whims. Having been satisfied is an active structure in the Bailout trick, at which point you have that system which has systematically removed us from the protections of the plot armor and into the catastrophic wilderness which would destroy us all if we do not begin to build men and call upon God and ask Him to forgive us and to heal our lands and the rest of the things that are fundamentally necessary to a stable society. And even if you don't believe in God, you just have to observe the laws of nature. And the laws of nature, being the foundation of the United States Constitution and its laws, generates at its foundation the agreement that one must be reasonable. The Pact is the society. And since the Pact is the society, it is an actively arbitrary exchanging thing with the Pact or society. The human community has at its interest of developing the security and progress of the Pact in the larger world. Now, this subject is not the entire world and its infinite differing units which are actively competing and in many cases killing each other. The reference is the community itself at its own specific unit. And the community as its own specific unit generates the rules necessary for it to competently remain stable and collaborating in diplomacy with other units around the structural world, giving deference to the need of the foundation of its particular uses, at which points the threats having been settled according to proper negotiations of reason is the only way for us to survive this. So, believe in God or don't believe in God, it's quite irrelevant. All you have to do is be competent enough to assert that diplomacy and reason should be our ruling principle. Primarily at its foundation, you have the agreement of the Constitution. And fundamental to the Constitution is the agreement in our Civil War with the Confederates, the foundation of the issue of slavery, or eminent domain against persons for the extortion of their labor or primarily selling them as a service on the open market in order to assert the extortion of their particulars as chattel, at which point the assertion that slavery exists is fundamental to Lindsey Graham's program, at which point the only way for us to have won is for the acknowledgement that those slavery programs are specifically prohibited by law already, and the non-existence of due process by their subversive counter-intellectual arguments generates the pre-crime circle jerk of fraudulent accusations, which generates false conclusions for the forming of chattel. Now, California, when it was headed up by Kamala Harris, actively engaged in slavery rackets by the ingestion of prisoners beyond its lawful authority, such as the holding of a known innocent person beyond the legal limitation and holding them beyond their term in order to engage in the extortion has actively supported the precept of slavery for the sake of slavery as a Confederate foundation in its contest against the United States at large, at which point you have the normalized systems which generate our active contest of threats against each other, which requires the specific and unique techniques necessary in order to resolve our particular disagreements, including the renouncing of Bale's trap in favor of competent, stable negotiations in the service of acquiring American centralized forces in order to assert the dominance of American law against all threats to the public, foreign and domestic, which is primarily Confederate insurrectionist slavery. The extortion of those services without being paid is fundamental to Lindsey Graham's systems, as the position of having captured them for the false experiments generates the extortion racket, which allows them to actively be traded on, which allows for the criminal reduction of status, which allows for the criminal reduction of human decency, and with the criminal reduction of status, you have a change in the sexual market value charts, which asserts whether or not the significant others would find you attractive or appealing for the particular sexual roles, generating the illusion by the rape culture in order to predetermine the winners and the losers. At which point, the women choosing to stay with their rapists is an active affirmation of their larger abuses in that structure. Now, those who are actively trading off of the 83 policy have already acknowledged the interest of the abuse as its own particular service, such as the domestic abusers in the police force, which are a substantive number as they have actively been changed to the alignment of the Confederacy, which is the normalization of the interest of creating abuse as a particular release or addiction. At which point, abuse itself being an addiction is actively traded on that market, asserting the position of their those who are trading for the protection of women against abuse into the women's centers and their recovery centers and protecting them from their abusers, which can just ask their Confederate counterparts to tell them how to subvert the thing and buy the proper permits and process everything, and then you're back to square one. At which point you have the active enforcement of these illusions, allowing the rest of the community to have a false justification to blame the victim because it's the victim's fault for not being able to subvert the thing, when in reality they're observing the distraction. And that strong delusion allows for the perpetual reinforcement of the core mechanic of Confederacy, which is the abuse of the chattel. So while asserting your position at the top of the communist chosen elite, the women having sex with their rapists might be fine for them in an acceptable, comfortable mechanism, but it is by definition responsible in the larger scheme of things for the domestic abuse abroad, at which point their refusal to comply is essential to stopping the abuse at the larger structure, as with the non-payment of the delivered promise of each contract, you have a loss of confidence in their trading mechanism, which allows for the collapse of their larger structure. At which point, Confederate wives having sex with their Confederate husbands creates the abused women in question as a direct consequence of itself by the permission or tolerance of the existence of the trade of Lindsey Graham's human trafficking exchange that has an interest of doing whatever they want for any reason to a target, including race, which allows them the position of that abuse. Their investment into the brokering network itself is the tolerance of the abuse of the rest of the network, at which point the assertion of the irony of J-secular civil war is that they are the most guilty of the thing that they pretend while failing to have a logical string of thinking in order to have finished a complete thought which could have concluded a reasonable solution towards their favor, at which point their incompetence reveals their guilt. Take, for instance, another example of the claim that the United States isn't responsible for the major dumping of trash into the ocean, when the position from the United States is to sell it to the poorer countries, such as in Asia and in Africa, at which point, when they dump it into the ocean, it creates the large mass of plastic inside the Pacific Ocean. At which point, when they are questioned on the issue of whether or not their trash is going into the Pacific Ocean, they're subverting the position by claiming that it's something minuscule like 5 or 3%, when in reality, it's the majority to all of it. At which point, the act of having sold it to the other countries is the real example, but by the intentional censoring of obfuscation of the most crucial piece of information, you have a substantive changing in the definition, at which point it in alignment as a strategy according to the Black Laws Dictionary includes changing the definition in part as to completely change the entire meaning of the word at a later bit, at which point it is the substantive racket of fraud by criminal subversions of the proceedings of any fair observer, at which point the obfuscation of reality or rejection of base reality is fundamental to their argument, at which point you have your higher government investments into the obfuscation of reality, which has at the illusion to the base reality in order to change those who are saying the correct thing but are challenged by a great delusion of the illusion generated in that scheme, at which point you have the total subversion in protection of the criminal injury which they have sold under their contracts, similar to the structure of their interest to sell government federal lands from the BLM of protected force. The ability to have collected it was not legal at the time that they have generated it, and their interest to sell it, having already cornered the market on the issue, generates the exponential profits from the potential mineral resources inside nature from that position. At which point, these larger long-term schemes, in collaboration with the other social trusts, generates the systems which have phantom cells over exponential periods of time in order to injure larger structures which at their foundation seem benign but are in realization catastrophic events from the maturity of the criminal damages from the criminal intent from the insurrectionist Confederate double agents. At which point you have many of these censorship campaigns and isolation campaigns which have been legislated into the code, which Congress does not have authority to give permission to, which is actively ignored by the double agent Confederates, especially in the executive, which is actively generating insurrectionist tensions against them, facilitating the normalization of not reading bills pushed through them, at which point you would naturally have a harassment campaign systematically attached to them passing something that they aren't allowed to read. As Confederates are not loyal to the United States, the passing of that system, which does not have a lawful permission in order to exist, even if it had gone through that process, was not through that process, and it was not legal, and the judiciary being attacked by the double agents and subverted by the insurrectionists has the equivalent structure of that system, as the total system is collapsed into the systemic racist arrangements of the Confederate terrorist operations, allowing for the wars which have been generated on the pre-planning of the destruction of the factions of the planned proxy war structures in order to assert absolute dominance, which is the reproduction of the Nazi arrangement of destroying all competitor factions, such as their destruction of the Jews, the socialists, and all of the others underneath it, until you've refined the factions or political identities to the core political identity, and the rest of them are traded as chattel slavery. Observe at interest the primary results from the chattel slavery, as the wealth of the South, having been centralized to the slave owners, was catastrophically inferior and overwhelmed by the profits and wealth of the North, which was not using the slavery structure. At which point, the thing that they are most loyal to is incompetence, which is actively subverting their own progressive profits. But since they are actively investing into the advantage of abuse as a primary profit product, their overspending into that particular arrangement leaves them exponentially vulnerable to other things which had preferred in a larger interest the preferred ability to have purchased the alternative products instead of the abuse, at which point the acts of addicts into the position normalized in the drug war, facilitates the compulsion in order to pay for it, at which points they scrape and they deplete and they destroy their entire lives in order to acquire it, and they destroy those around them in order to acquire the resources in order to buy their addiction until they collapse themselves. And that is the inevitable fate of the parasite confederacy, to die of starvation by their own hand, for their foolish leaders are suicidal in their lusts. Take a note from history, from the thing that they are actively pursuing in the Soviet-style governing system, adapted to the Confederacy as a faction under the wizard communism structure. The recommendation of those who view the United States as aggressive partners, such as Vladimir Putin, has actively in the past recommended against these historic investments into failed subjects, at which point the active investment into the systems which they are doing is known history as to invest into failure, and it having been recommended against is an active injury to the society that it is infected, at which point you have to observe the obligations of the need to survive, and the rest of the reasons which justify the mechanism of making that potential of the survival of the general society is the acknowledgement of the infection for a cure, the acknowledgement of the cancer for a cure, the acknowledgement of the parasite for the surgery to remove the catastrophic death cult, which asserts the inevitability of the complete destruction of everything, such as their arrangements for the major oil spill inside of Ohio from the train derailment, at which point the FEMA, who is specifically designed to subvert the damages of that arrangement, actively avoided helping them, as the purpose of the insurrection is the act of Lindsey Graham's war against the American civilian population. These damages are on purpose, and thus there is no intent on using federal resources in order to solve federal crimes against the public intended by the Confederate double agents, obstructing justice as to prevent the possibility of the security from withholding itself, at which point you have the series of damages which are essential in the war on David, which have to be understood in the larger context in order to facilitate any reasonable solution. And the position that they could technically solve it without David is itself a self-delusion, misdirection, in order to fool people into the larger con. At which point, similar to the Ohio scenario, the alternatives to David's security are abject failures, and the observation of enjoying the privileges of the alternative securities is completely unreliable in its suicide tendencies, at which point you have only the hope of a horrible death and the brutal murder of your loved ones by your dedication to the psychotic enemies of your society. The inevitability of you dying as a result of refusing to comply with the necessary functions of your survival includes the arrest of these Confederate enemies of the United States. There is no legitimate alternative except to the duel, the restoration of David Bowles for the leading of the security mechanism to convince Congress to declare war on the Confederacy, to remove the threats to the United States, is essential to your survival. The end.